get started, and hopefully a few more people will trickle in as we get going. Hello everyone, welcome to our monthly meeting for August. This is the Green Party Trade Union Group. If you weren't expecting that, you're in the wrong Zoom call. But we're really excited to have a guest speaker with us for this meeting. And that speaker is Daniel Randall from the campaign Free Our Unions. They're going to be able to introduce themselves much better than I can, so I'm going to leave that to them. A couple of housekeeping things. As most of you have, possibly all of you have already heard, there's an agenda for this meeting, and if you signed up through Action Network, you will have got a link to it. I will also put the link in the Zoom chat so that you've got it there. We are recording this meeting, so if you're sort of not happy for your face or your voice to sort of risk being caught on, on camera, do just feel free to turn your camera off. That's absolutely fine. If you're not speaking or meant to be speaking, please do keep your microphone muted. It makes it better for everyone. And that's more or less it. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel Randall to introduce themselves and the campaign. So over to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Matthew. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invite. So I'm Daniel Randall. I'm a railway worker. I work on the Underground in London, and I'm a rep for the RMT union. I'm speaking here as one of the co-organisers of Free Our Unions. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I'm going to start by giving a quick introduction to what Free Our Unions is and what we do, for those who may not have heard of us. So we're a grassroots labour movement campaign against anti-union and anti-strike legislation that exists to raise awareness of how such legislation kind of makes our lives as workers worse, really. We organise information campaigns, public events, sometimes direct action, and our supporters are active inside their own unions, fighting for those unions to adopt a kind of radical approach to these issues. We're supported by 4 trade unions at national level. That's the Fire Brigades Union, my own union, the RMT, the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union, the PCS, which is the Public and Commercial Services Union, the main union in the civil service, and the IWGB, which is the Independent Workers Union of Great Britain. And we're backed by dozens of local union branches and committees at a kind of local level. We organise on quite an open basis, or aspire to, via open organising meetings. We produce regular briefings and materials for supporters to use in workplaces and communities. And we try and aim for that not to be a kind of passive relationship where supporters just sort of dutifully hand out materials produced by a distant centre, but rather an active one with supporters themselves producing materials explaining the relevance of anti-union laws to the spheres of activity that they're involved in. So if you want to stay in touch with our campaign on an individual level after today's meeting, I'll put a link in the chat later on to a contact form on our website. I think I'm right in saying that the Green Party Trade Union Group has already in the past taken quite a strong stance in policy terms against anti-union and anti-strike legislation. So I'm kind of assuming I don't have to spend any time convincing you that it is necessary to oppose anti-union laws. But if that's an incorrect assumption, that's fine, and we can kind of discuss that later on. Nevertheless, as trade unionists and activists who organise on a day-to-day basis within the constraints that these laws impose on us, including what might be termed their kind of deadening effect on consciousness, I think it can be useful to take a step back and think about the issue in context, in order that we can sort of strengthen the foundations of our opposition. So what I'm going to do with this talk, and I don't intend to speak for more than 15 minutes, and probably less than that, is to give a bit of background in terms of how we in Free Our Unions approach the issues, and then talk about why I think there are particular and specific possibilities for collaboration between us as a campaign and yourselves as green trade unionists that I hope we can explore in the discussion. So as I'm sure many of you know, Britain has what Tony Blair once proudly called the most restrictive union laws in the Western world. How unions organise, when and how we can take industrial action and over what issues are all severely restricted by this legislative regime. And any worker aged around probably 45 or under has spent more or less their entire working life under that legislative regime. The laws which most constrain us today began to be introduced under Thatcher, were progressively added to throughout subsequent decades of Tory rule, and disgracefully were left entirely intact by 13 years of Labour government. The constraints of these laws seem so solid that it often feels somewhat kind of fantastical to imagine that things could ever be different. So the idea, for example, that workers could just get together in the staff room or in the canteen, hold a meeting, take a vote then or there, show of hands, do you want to go on strike? Yes, and walk out the door. And for that to be perfectly legal and legitimate, that kind of seems unimaginable to many, even to such an extent that many well-meaning figures in the trade union movement sometimes kind of recoil from the ostensible radicalism of demanding the restoration of such rights, and feel it necessary to rather cringingly preface their comments about anti-union laws with assurances that, you know, no one wants to go back to the bad old days of the 1970s. You know, you hear that kind of thing even from people within the movement. And there was indeed much about the 1970s that was bad, both in general and in terms of the trade union movement as it was then, or so I'm told. I wasn't there personally. But we should make no apology, I would argue, for aspiring to at least the levels of legislative freedom and social power that organised labour had then, and in fact to much greater levels. That kind of contraction of horizons, I think, also leads to a tendency to think of anti-union laws really only in terms of the most recent ones, which is the 2016 Trade Union Act, which is the bill that imposed things like turnout thresholds in industrial action ballots. But that law, that act, is only one facet of the legislative restrictions on our rights to organise and take action, and in many ways not the worst. So a big focus of Free Our Unions as a campaign has been to try and resist and push back against that kind of ideological retreat to only talking about the most recent anti-union laws and maintaining a perspective of confronting the older laws, the laws, for example, which prohibit workplace voting, which prohibit striking in solidarity with other workers, and which prohibit striking over political issues. And it's a particularly important moment for the labour movement, the trade union movement, to step up our campaign against these laws now, because that legislative regime is set to get worse. I'm sure you've all heard of the police bill, the bill that will restrict yet further our rights to protest and dissent. Free Our Unions has published an extensive briefing examining the effect that bill will have on unions and workplace organising specifically, which you can read on our website. And again, I'll post a link in the chat when I'm done talking. And beyond this, the Tories have a manifesto commitment to implement so-called minimum service requirements during transport strikes, something that will obviously directly affect me and my workmates and you and yours if you work in the transport industry. It's not yet clear how they envisage that system working in Britain, but in other countries with similar laws, they involve transport unions designating a section of their membership as kind of exempt from striking in order that those workers can provide the legally stipulated minimum service. So that means that unions essentially have to facilitate scabbing. And the political aim here is very clear. That's to minimise the impact of strikes and essentially reduce them to the status of a token protest rather than a leveraging of workers' power. We don't know the timescale for the implementation of that new law. Government priorities have obviously been recalibrated a lot by the pandemic, but that's something the government is still committed to and could decide to bring forward at any time. And if those new laws are passed, they won't stop with transport workers. The government already has a list of so-called essential services which are subject to additional restrictions under the 2016 Trade Union Act. And that includes healthcare, education, the fire service. And if they impose minimum service requirements on us, then I think we could, transport workers that is, I think we can have no doubt that those sectors will be next. So that's the kind of general context. And I want to talk now about some specific points of potential convergence between the fight against anti-union laws and what might be some of your priorities as green trade unionists. So in the interest of full disclosure, I myself am a Labour Party member and a supporter of the revolutionary socialist group Workers' Liberty. But although some of Free Our Unions' activity historically has been oriented around kind of policy debates inside the Labour Party, we're not a solely Labour-focused campaign, and we're very keen to work with trade unionists from other radical traditions. So the first point of convergence I want to suggest is around the question of democracy. I know the Green Party is strongly committed to democratic reform, and I would argue that the restrictions on the right to strike that we have in Britain are one of, if not the most significant break on meaningful democratic action in this country today. And I want to suggest that repealing anti-union and anti-strike laws would represent as meaningful an expansion of democracy as reforming the electoral system. Without a full right to strike, we're essentially subject to the dictatorship of the boss. Democracy ends as soon as we set foot in the workplace. And in a context in which our hard right nationalist government is proposing legislation to restrict the right to protest, to further restrict workers' rights to organise and strike, as we've just discussed, gerrymandering constituency boundaries, all of that, I think you have to say that this adds up to a potentially quite serious assault on democracy. The first mass workers' movement in this country, Chartism, was a movement for democracy, in effect, a movement against the dictatorship of the rich. And I think the contemporary trade union movement needs to reclaim some of that spirit today. And I think that you, as trade unionists, active in a party strongly committed to an expansion of democracy, could really help to sort of leaven that by making campaigning against anti-union laws a strategic priority. The second point of specific convergence I want to talk about is around the obviously central question of climate change. As I'm sure many of you know, the origin of the term green as a political label lies in a workers' struggle, a trade union struggle, the green bans movement of Australian construction workers in the 1970s, who leveraged their class power, their power over the production process, to shut down environmentally and socially destructive construction projects. If you're not familiar with this episode of kind of class struggle history, I'd really urge you to learn about it. In my view, it's one of the sort of world historic high points of grassroots-led trade unionism that was both politically and industrially and ecologically radical. So if only in a kind of nominative sense, the green tradition is linked to this class-based, workplace-based, union-based struggle. And I think we desperately need a new green bans movement today. We need workers to have the freedom to strike not only over narrow economic issues in so-called official trade disputes, but over political issues, so that we can leverage our class power to demand radical climate action from government and the conversion and transitioning of our workplaces from our employers. We need the freedom to strike in solidarity with others, including with youth climate strikers. And workers in high emissions industries need the freedom to strike to demand transition and conversion, recapturing the spirit of the Lucas aerospace workers, I'm sure many of you have heard of, who in 1970s developed a plan to repurpose their employers' productive capacity away from making military hardware in order to make medical equipment and renewable energy technology. I imagine that the phrase, the slogan, climate change is caused by capitalism is fairly uncontroversial in this room. And if that's the case, and if we see the working class as a key anti-capitalist actor, the key anti-capitalist actor, I would argue, then I think we are impelled to confront the legal shackles that the capitalist state has placed on us in its own self-defense. Free Our Unions is currently supporting Earth Strike, who some comrades may have heard of, which is a network of anti-capitalist activists coming out of the climate strike movement, in a new initiative that they've launched called Empower the Unions. This initiative aims to connect trade unionists and climate activists, drawing on traditions of working class direct action for the environment, like green bans, like the Lucas Plan, and more recent struggles like the occupation of the Vestas wind turbine factory on the Isle of Wight in 2009, in order to highlight how anti-union and anti-strike laws inhibit such action today. And that's one specific area of activity in which I'd really urge Green Party trade unionists to come and work alongside us. The formal political situation in this country is obviously very bleak, and I'm sure none of us expect on any short or medium-term timescale the election of a government likely to repeal the laws that I'm talking about. I think the sort of social imperative to break and defy these laws will confront us much sooner than we have any prospect of seeing them repealed. In fact, I believe that imperative is already confronting us. But I also believe that continually highlighting these laws, raising consciousness around them, and explaining their essential nature as sort of legislative weapons of class warfare in the hands of bosses and their state, which I know sounds a bit dramatic, but I think that's really what they are, which menace the future of the planet as well as constraining our democratic rights. So highlighting all of that and demanding our freedom from these laws, even when that demand isn't necessarily immediately likely to be won. I think that perspective is an essential part of the means by which our movement can develop the confidence to defy, subvert, and break these laws when we have to. Ultimately, that's what Free Our Unions exists to do as a campaign, And if you agree with the kind of perspective I've sketched out, then I hope we can discuss how we might work together to advance it. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Daniel. That was absolutely wonderful. I'm sure I speak for everyone on this call when I say thanks so much for coming to speak to us. I don't know sort of what you're like for time, whether you've got time to stay, possibly field 1 or 2 questions. Would that be...
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. I know I've got 1 or 2, and I'm sure I'm not alone. So yeah, if you've got a question for Daniel about the campaign, about any of the things he's mentioned, please do use the raise hand function in Zoom, or just pop something in the chat to let us know. I'm going to use my overwhelming power as chair to pose the first one. I was just jumping off what you said about Earthstrike UK and the work you're doing with them. It struck me sort of at the time a bit, but the more I think about it, that the decision that a lot of school kids and people who are now in university, going to be going to the workforce very soon, took when they sort of walked out of school for a day, and they called it a strike, using the language of workers' action. It seemed quite significant. Do you think that there's a sort of strong relationship to be built between the school strikes movement, which itself has sort of seemingly subsided, but do you think there's a link to be built between the people who are involved in that and unions, and what do you think that could look like?
Did you want to take a few questions in one go, or should I come back one by one? Or
I'm looking. Yeah, I think that's good. That's a good idea. I'm just sort of looking around. I haven't seen any hands up, although if you're waving at me, I'm unlikely to be able to see you because of Zoom. But if you could put something in the chat just to let us know you've got a question, or use the raise hand function, that'd be great. Dan, can you see any other sort of questions?
I don't think so, except somebody asking me in the chat if I'm the Daniel Randall who debated Wes Streeting on free education years ago. Yes, I am. Yeah, in my misspent youth as a student activist, that was me. So, okay, I'll come back on your question then, Matthew, about the kind of school strike movement and the potential there. Yeah, I mean, I think you're very right to kind of call attention to the fact that they're using the language of strikes, right? And certainly in my experience of talking to school strikers, there's a really impressive instinctive understanding that workers and organised labour have a kind of much greater degree of political economic leverage than they do, bluntly. Which is not to minimise the importance of what they've done. It's incredibly inspiring, and I hope it continues. But it's pretty clear to any of them that if transport workers were to go on strike, if their teachers were to go on strike, the kind of ripples that would have and the effect that would cause would massively amplify the struggle. The London Chamber of Commerce, which is a sort of federation of small businesses in London, did a study a few years ago, and it estimated that for every day, so I work on the tube, and it estimated that for every day tube workers are on strike, the cost to the London economy of a single day's strike on the underground is about £300 million. That's a pre-pandemic statistic, obviously, but I think that's just a tiny little insight into the potential power that organised labour has. So this is really the sort of key question, right? How can we transform the labour movement, both on a sort of organisational level and on the level of consciousness, the small L labour movement, just to be clear there, the workers' movement. How can we transform it so we can leverage that class power in pursuit of radical environmental aims in the way that the Australian construction workers of the 1970s did? And I think some of the links we're trying to make with Earth Strike now, calling attention to the way existing anti-union laws shackle that and kind of deaden that. That's part of it. I think another essential part of it is opening up this debate inside the unions, because Unite, for example, on policy on paper has a reasonably good kind of green jobs policy, but it's also in favour of airport expansion. So there's a really important sort of debate to be had about the politics of the matter inside trade unions. And then finally, looking at what all of us can do wherever we work and whatever our workplaces are, to develop equivalents of the Lucas plan. So plans to, very pleasant kind of piano jingle, whoever's playing that in the background, develop kind of equivalents of the Lucas plan to transition the productive capacity of our own workplaces away from carbon intensive production. None of that's easy, and the scale of the task relative to the time in which we've got to do it is daunting, but I think it's our only option. There's no shortcuts around that. So I know that I kind of answered your question by sort of posing more questions, but
Well, no, thanks. That was great. And in the time you've been speaking, we've got a couple more hands up. So we can go to Martin Francis and then to Bill Harrop, and then probably back to Daniel. Martin, take it away.
Hi, I'm a veteran of many a 70s strike and walkout and so on. So really welcome your campaign. Apart from repealing the trade union laws, are you also looking at ways to extend the rights of trade unions, which may not be covered by that repeal? Just one of those issues, the Young Greens, in fact, initiated a campaign for the right for trade union organisers to enter premises to address workers and to organise them. I'm in the NEU, previously NUT, and with privatisation of education, the academies and free schools and so on, it's really important to try and get access to those workplaces. So a demand along those lines would be very welcome as well.
And then Bill, do you want to add your question?
Yeah. Hi, Daniel. Great speech. Very passionate. Yeah, it's very rare to see that these days. I'm a bus driver in Manchester. I work for Unite. I apologise on behalf of the union. The problem with it, as far as I can see, is it's jack of all trades and master of none. I joined it when it was Transport and General Workers Union, but at least had a little bit of direction there. Now they've got the fingers in all sorts of pies. Anyway, I'm digressing. The question I wanted to ask is, I'm relatively late to being politically aware. I didn't actually get involved in anything until I'm not going to give my age away, but let's say in the last couple of decades, with the community empowerment networks and the recognition there that there was a serious democratic deficit, not just in political organisations, but in any way for people getting involved. And I was quite surprised when following one of the links as a result of this going out to see how many different pieces of legislation there has been since 1980 to sort of chip and chip and chip and chip away at union rights. The main point of the question is, considering the vast number of them, which would be the priorities, in your opinion, to focus on? Because we can't do it all in one foul sweep. So where would the priorities lie?
Shall I come back on that, Matthew? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that. So yeah, a couple of really good questions and contributions there. Firstly, in response to Martin, yeah, really good question, and the answer is yes. So our approach is, we kind of summarise it as repeal and replace. So it's not just about the abolition of existing laws; it's about their replacement with a positive kind of Bill of Rights, if you like. Which would legally enshrine positive rights to, yeah, absolutely, trade union access to workplace, as you've talked about, positive rights for unions to hold meetings and balloting and voting in the workplace, positive rights for unions to strike over issues of their choosing, et cetera, et cetera. So absolutely, yes, it's definitely for us about not just the kind of negative demand of the abolition of existing laws, but the positive demand of replacing them with laws that would enshrine those legal rights. And to Bill, I mean, look, firstly, I know you were saying it in jest, but look, there's no need for you or anyone else to apologise for their union. No organisation is perfect. You know, every organisation is a sort of terrain of struggle. I know that's a kind of slightly cliched, sort of trotty phrase, but I think it's true, right? Any political organisation, any trade union is a terrain of struggle, and that's what we're involved in it to do, to kind of transform it and improve it as an organisation. So it would be good, in fact, to link up and discuss what could be done in Unite. Some Free Our Union supporters in Unite recently did a kind of open letter around trying to get Unite to act on its own policies around anti-union laws, which again, it has very good policy on paper, but doesn't often do a lot about it. So there is a kind of little Free Our Unions initiative in Unite. I'll post the link to that in the chat as well. And then to respond to the question you asked, another really good question, like, okay, what are the priorities? What would be the priorities? I guess I give two answers, and I'm going to sort of have my cake and eat it, right? Because I'm not sure we do have to like limit the horizons. I think part of what Free Our Unions' perspective has been about is about saying that, yes, although you're absolutely right, there has been this kind of build-up and aggregation of different acts, of different legislation from 1980 onwards, which has led to this kind of perspective that we need to sort of chip away at them. Our perspective has very much been, we don't have to accept any of them, and that actually we should maintain the demand of saying any law that inhibits and restricts workers' rights to strike should be repealed, and we shouldn't apologise for demanding its repeal. Having said all that, I do think there are some particular aspects of the legislative regime that in a way are not, I don't want to say worse than others, but I think do constrain us in particularly pointed ways. And I would point to the restrictions on how unions can strike effectively, right? So the law prohibiting workplace meetings, workplace voting, I believe that was one of the provisions of the 1980 Employment Act. So that was quite early on, was the ban on workplace voting. The ban on striking in solidarity with other workers, the ban on striking over political issues. So for me, that kind of package, the restrictions on when and how our unions can take action, or rather when and how workers can take action through our unions, in a sense, they're the most damaging, because they're the ones that put the greatest shackles on our ability to act and on our democratic rights. You know, and I'd finish by returning to that point that this isn't just a kind of economic issue, an industrial issue. It's a fundamental issue of democratic rights. That if you don't have a full right to strike, if the state constrains the ways in which you are allowed to withdraw your labour and the issues over which you are allowed to withdraw it and the process you have to go through before you're allowed to do that, then you know you don't have full democratic rights. You are subject to the dictatorship of the boss. So I kind of cheated your answer. On the one hand, I'm saying we don't have to pick, and then I picked. But I hope that goes somewhere to a response.
Thanks very much. I'm just looking down the list now. We've got a few more minutes for questions. So if you do have a question for Daniel, whether it's about the campaign or about something that they've said, please do stick your hand up. Yeah, I'll just sort of leave some sort of silence hanging so that we've got a few seconds for you to raise your hand or pop something in the chat.
There's a question in the chat from Mick Wall.
Mick, do you want to come in with your question? Okay.
Shall I read it to you?
Yeah.
It's about the Green Party, I think. How engaged is the Green Party in opening up significant dialogue with trade unions, especially given the Labour Party's severe stance on any support of other parties by their members. So how are we opening up to engagement with other trade unions, with trade unions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's probably more of a question for a Green Party spokesperson.
Yeah, that's what I said.
I'm sure you have a perspective on this, Daniel. So.
Well, I'd like to hear. I was actually going to say, if I could, if I could ask a question and kind of extend that question that Mick's asking. I mean, I'm interested to hear from you and from comrades in this meeting about, what you think about the sort of those points of convergence I suggested between this endeavour, the campaign against anti-union, anti-strike legislation, and what might be some of the potential priorities of Green trade unionists. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear anyone who's got an answer to Mick's question, but also any thoughts on what you think the potentials for convergence are.
So the table's been turned and a question has been directed to the audience. Does anyone want to, make a contribution on sort of on that score? The floor is yours. We've got a hand from Lois. Lois, do you want to step up to the podium?
Yes, thanks. Main thing that the Green Party needs to do is put a budget for campaigning. We need to be able to, help when we join actions with printing leaflets and banners and so on. So that's number one. I'm not sure how we get to do that, but that's what we need to do. We don't have one at the moment.
Thanks very much, Lois. Bill, what's the hand up?
To me, that's a no-brainer. Without any sort of convergence and coming together, we're pretty much up the creek. The partisan system as it currently exists, being exclusive and controlling and manipulative, is anything but democratic. It's oligarchic, and I think without that level of coming together and convergence and working together as a whole, because after all, there is only us. It's just a shame they don't realise it.
Yeah, if I can come in, I think, Matthew, you're being quite modest. Matthew's been working with the health unions in various different guises, including the workers' voice of NHS workers' voice and so on, but also through Keep Our NHS Public and campaigns against privatisation of GP services. So that's an area where we have dialogue with other trade unionists, many different trade unions, and also some of us work through trades councils, where we work with Labour Party members and trade union members, and in our case, members of the SWP and the Communist Party as well. So those dialogues take place in various local campaigns. Something that I'm involved in is the Anti-Academies Alliance, which includes, again, the NEU, but other trade unions and trade union reps in various workplaces. So the level of engagement is there. How to bring up the battle over trade union rights as such, I think that will come as we actually get near general election, etc., and start to try and influence the Labour Party and other parties standing to make that part of the platform.
Thanks very much, Martin. We've got a hand from Rebecca Mulvaney, who actually deserves the plaudits for work on raising the profile of the NHS campaigns. So do you want to speak up, Rebecca?
Yeah, only briefly. Sorry, I haven't got my camera on because I'm sat in my kitchen and it's really messy. But I just wanted to say that in response to sort of Mick's question about how engaged is the Green Party, I think it depends on what you mean by the Green Party, because I know that there's a number of individual members of the party who are very proactive in opening up that dialogue, either through their own sort of trade union membership or through sort of work on campaigns such as the NHS pay rise campaign. And there's also a number of elected members of the Green Party who are also really engaged with trade unions or are themselves members of trade unions. But it's a bit of a mixed picture. We don't have those formalised relationships with the trade union movement as Labour does. And also there can be some opposition to the sort of formalization of those relationships from within the Green Party, because it's sort of seen that, you know, the unions are a barrier in some cases to taking action on the climate crisis, and they're a barrier to achieving some of the Green Party's sort of overarching philosophical goals. But within that, you know, I don't think that we have dreadful policy on trade unions in our sort of Green Party book of policies. You know, I think that it is something that we talk about. This group exists, and there are members sort of supporting trade union campaigns, but it's the direction of where that might go in the future and how often it's talked about, particularly when we come to a general election. It's patchy.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I'll just add sort of one or two things, just sneak a couple of things in, and partly to sound a sort of slightly more, I suppose, hopefully slightly more positive note, in that I think there is sort of, or the sense I get anyway, is that there is sort of widespread, you know, like sympathy with the aims. And I think, you know, when confronted with this question, you know, most Greens, all Greens I know, you know, most of them across the board would, you know, fall on the right side of the line. You know, they'd recognise that, that, as you say, you know, the restrictions on the right to strike and the right to withhold one's labour are restrictions on democratic rights, and we need to take those back. I expect sort of wide sympathy in that regard. I think it's when, you know, when you're facing the public, I think that's when the real test comes. You know, anyone can express solidarity in a tweet, a simple message or an email, but, you know, when it comes to speaking to people on the doorstep and standing firm and really counteracting some of those sort of like right-wing propaganda that, you know, the media will surely start up with whenever the RMT strikes on the underground, or whenever health workers, certainly whenever they strike, everyone, including our spokespeople, need to be ready to stand up to that. And I think that's the real test. But I also think it's a huge opportunity. You know, we know that, as you were saying, you know, the media and indeed the state adopts a particular tone when certain key workers decide to strike, and health workers are one of those groups. So, you know, fingers crossed, you know, we'll see consultative ballots reject the government's 3% pay offer for NHS staff, and hopefully even better, you know, we'll see ballots for industrial action. And I think when we do see that among NHS staff, there's a real opportunity for the Green Party to be a really loud voice saying, you know, it is the right of health workers to take strike action, and we can highlight the ways in which current legislation and the current framework stops them from exercising those rights. So I think opportunities will crop up, but it's keeping that focus. And if that's something that this group of us can help to do, then so much the better. Yeah, I mean, does that answer your question, Daniel?
Yeah, it does, or it certainly begins to answer it. So, I mean, something else I'd be interested to hear from you on now if we have time, but just in a kind of ongoing sense. If not, is you know, where the sort of policy debate over this stuff is at in the Green Party, because I know, like I say, I know the Green Party Trade Union Group has made pretty strong radical statements on this issue in the past. There wasn't much detail on this question in the Green Party's last election manifesto. So I'd be interested to know whether that's just a reflection of like it not being a priority, or if there's some kind of political tension around the issue. Because yeah, I mean, I'm aware that, as Rebecca said, that there are people in your party who, let's say, are a bit kind of suspicious, at least to put it mildly, of trade unions as a sort of social force. And I guess part of what this discussion could be about is, okay, well, how can that be broken down? So that, I mean, that's probably a kind of a longer and more ongoing discussion that we won't have time to crack today.
Yeah, a really important question, to be sure, and one that I'm sure all of us in this room.
I think Pete's waving at you as well.
Confront in our local parties. I could see, yeah, Pete's waving. I can also see a hand up from Kafensi. So should we go to Kafensi and then to Pete? Yeah, Quincy, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just I'm a part of GPEX. It's basically the executive committee board, basically, that I represent the trade union. I am the trade union liaison officer, so obviously I bring any sort of issues that the trade union has to the board. And when I first started as trade union liaison officer, I realized there was a massive disconnect, basically, between the priorities of what GPEX and to the party at large, to a certain extent, of what their priorities were. And a lot of it wasn't trade union based, basically. It was like, okay, we'll talk about, you know, climate, we'll talk about some social justice, you know, stuff, we'll talk about, like, you know, racial justice stuff, cool. But then it wasn't like, there wasn't an automatic linkage to go, okay, then let's talk to working class people. What the working class people tend to be a part of? Unions, so let's talk to unions. There wasn't that kind of linkage there. It's kind of like, well, let's talk to middle class people who probably have a bit of affluence of money, so get donations from them and talk about their issues. So there is that, like, we need this group, obviously, and I've been trying to as well push our priorities to GPEX about what we need to be done. And with the political strategy obviously being now being made and being pushed through, especially to the next general election and beyond, I think it's a chance for us to, and myself, to really push to say, okay, if we're going to talk about getting 30 MPs, we need to get as many people on our side as much as possible. And that involves people who are associated with unions. So we need to talk about their priorities, talk about what we can do for unions and how that, you know, impact, and how our policies impact them, basically. So I think every time you know, someone's talking, especially with this is a perfect chance with the leadership election, is what about trade unions? What about trade unions? What about working class? What about trade unions? What are you doing for those people? What are you doing for us? So it's important to continue to push that question and narrative for the future, basically. Otherwise, you kind of just become your own self-contained echo chamber where we're all agreeing with each other about what needs to be done, but then nothing's being done because it's not being put up to the higher ups.
First of all, I wanted to say to Daniel that you're asking the wrong people, because, you know, we're the tendency in the Green Party which has the most sympathy, and not just the Green Party Trade Union Group, but there are others with similar views to ours, who has the most, you know, sympathy with the Labour movement in general rather than the Labour Party as such. And the other point, I mean, there are people in the Green Party who seem, from my perspective at least, to be totally obsessed with electoralism. Winning elections doesn't matter really what it's about, just win the election, and appeal to any voter you can. And I you know, I think a lot of us feel that's not the way to go, and that and the other point I was making is that inside the Labour movement, there are many tendencies and movements and organisations which have common concerns with the Green Party, issues like a Green New Deal, issues like just transition, and also concerns about, you know, various of the technical fixes, like, you know, is hydrogen, which the Labour Party, some people in the Labour Party seem to think is a magic fix. Is it really a magic fix? You know, and what Green Party people need to do is get involved with some of these organisations which are Labour movement, not Labour Party organisations, like the Greener Jobs Alliance, like what else is there? Greener Jobs Alliance, the Campaign Against Climate Change, Trade Union Group, and then we can start building the links. And I think everybody in the Green Party should do more of that. I think that's enough, and sorry about the earlier silence.
Thanks, Pete. It was much clearer in the end, so cheers for that. I can see we've got a hand from, should we take a contribution from Jake Welsh?
Yeah, sorry, Jake Welsh from Usdaw Rep and also Manchester Green Party. Yeah, there's been a bit of a history of sort of struggle between those of us who want trade union recognition to be like a stronger emphasis within the Green Party and those that, as Pete's just said, that want to be like fully elections focused. And you know, for example, in one of the proposed constitutions that's come up after the holistic review, we'll get rid of the trade union liaison from, you know, the new council that would be formed. And so it's up to us, I think, as green trade unionists, that we have to like convince the party that, you know, trade unions are important, and it's not just, you know, kind of similar to like how the Labour Party has been historically. It's not just been about winning elections, but it's been about the Labour movement. It's been about a grassroots movement of people that, you know, supporting trade union marches and also supporting, you know, strike action, etc. So like the more that we can do as individuals within our local parties and regional parties to have, like, for example, your local party or your regional party to have a trade union liaison officer. And I think in particular where the local parties, where we've got multiple councillors who can actually have an impact on some influence or impact on the council, it would be useful to have people who are maybe active in the local trade unions council to be the trade union liaison for that local party, and to sort of kind of, you know, get the councillors a bit more on board. And so at every level we kind of need a bit of pushback, and I think we'll get there if we're organised enough.
Thanks very much, Jake. We'll go to Jenny Linsdell next, and then I think we'll probably then have to move on to the rest of the agenda, as much as it pains me to say that. So, Jenny, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, I don't quite know how to frame my question because I'm not, I just am very, very interested in the trade union issues. But the big question surely at the moment, and how is the Green Party going to liaise with trade unions on the enormous changes that must happen because of climate change problems? You know, the whole fossil fuel industry, the agricultural business, everything is going to be touched with people having to retrain, do different jobs, change the way that things happen. I mean, it's an enormous question that surely we need the trade unions very much on board and to talk with them.
Thanks very much, Jenny. And Daniel, I don't know whether you want to sort of come back on that and maybe sort of round off your thoughts.
Yeah, if I could. Thanks very much. Well, look, firstly, just to say thanks again for having me. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I found it useful, and I hope you have too. Yeah, just a few points in conclusion in response to some of the issues there. Firstly, just to say as a sort of disclaimer, just to get this on the record in case some sort of officious bureaucrat from the Labour Party compliance unit gets hold of the recording of this. Look, and the discussions you were having about how policy on trade unions and relationship with trade unions might fit into a kind of Green Party electoral strategy, you know, that's a discussion I was very interested in to hear from you guys, but just to kind of make clear where we're all kind of coming from on that. Pete talked about some sort of labour movement based or labour movement oriented climate change campaigns that green activists might want to think about getting involved in. He talked about the campaign against climate change trade union group, which I've had a little bit of engagement with myself, and I just kind of urge you to add Empower the Unions, that new initiative from Earthstrike, to that list. You know, that's a group of predominantly young people coming out of the climate strike movement who want to have this sort of orientation to trade unions, to workers' action, and link that up with a radical climate politics. And I think, you know, a lot of the people in this meeting are kind of already on that page, and that initiative could definitely would definitely benefit from your involvement. So check it. It has its own social media presence. If you just Google Earth Strike Empower the Unions, you'll get all the info. There's a couple of open organising meetings coming up, so it'd be good to have some involvement there. And then look, finally on Jenny's question, which is, yeah, I mean, like, absolutely central. You know, that is sort of the central question of our time, is how can workers take power over the production process effectively to ensure that the transition that needs to happen is going to happen in a way that is beneficial to us rather than just to our employers, just to the state, and it doesn't happen in a way that's privileges the kind of needs of profit. No easy answers to any of that, of course, but I think we can definitely look to historical experiences like the Green. I mean, I think the Green Bands and the Lucas Plan are really kind of provide us with two of the essential models that go some way to answering the question Jenny's posing, right? Which is, so one, the Green Bands is about workers refusing to allow our labour to be used for something that's environmentally destructive. And that, you know, that has a kind of wide application for all sorts of different workers. And the Lucas Plan model is about a group of workers who are saying, well, look, actually our skills, the productive capacity of the place we work, could be used to do something different. So in a sense, that went a kind of step, you know, that goes a step further and attempts to repurpose productive power so that human need and environmental need, rather than the needs of profit, comes first. And just to say very finally, and to kind of bring it back to where I'm coming from tonight as a representative of Free Our Unions, all of that kind of action, you know, that is just absolutely essential to the kind of future we need to see, currently is all completely illegal. It's all completely illegal and entirely constrained by anti-union and anti-strike legislation. So I think an essential part of the endeavour to bring that horizon closer, to make that kind of action, workers' action for the climate, working class ecology, to make that kind of action possible, has to involve, as quite a central element, a confrontation with the legal restrictions that currently inhibit it. And that's what Free Our Unions exists to do. So thanks again for having me. It's been really good to be here.
Thanks very much, Dan. And I'm sure everyone will join me in a sort of Zoom appropriate round of applause. Thanks so much for coming. And yeah, I do hope that we stay closely in touch with you personally, but most importantly with the growing campaign. You can also sign up to get emails directly from Free Our Unions, which I'd recommend. You can just do that on their website, which I will share in the Zoom chat once or twice before this meeting's over. But yeah, thanks so much for coming, and like, feel free to hang around, but also feel free to go.